In 1986, in the quiet little town of Pill, Massachusetts, the Bowen family moved into a centuries-old colonial-style house tucked at the edge of a wooded property. Frank Bowen was doing his best to raise his two daughters alone after the devastating loss of his wife. Tina, the older of the two, was 16, introverted but strong. Her little sister, Karen, was only 9 and still struggling to understand the full weight of their mother's absence. At first, the move felt like a fresh start. The house was old, creaky, but charming in that historic New England kind of way. They settled in quickly. But within weeks, small oddities began creeping into their daily life, barely noticeable at first. Soft tapping in the walls. Light switches clicking off by themselves. Furniture just slightly out of place, like it had been nudged. They chalked it up to the house's age. Old homes do weird things, they figured. But then things escalated. One rainy Friday night, Tina and Karen decided to try the old Ouija board they found in the attic, treating it like a joke. They laughed and whispered spooky questions, not expecting anything to happen, until the planchette started to move on its own. The girls froze. Then came 3 sharp knocks from inside the wall behind them. That was the night fear took root. More incidents followed. Objects vanishing and reappearing. The TV would turn on by itself at 3 a.m., always to static. Frank began to feel like he was being watched. He'd catch glimpses of something in the mirror. Whispers in the hallway. And then it all exploded. Frank came home one night to find the entire house in chaos. The temperature inside was freezing despite the heater being cranked up. All the radios were hissing static. The kitchen faucet ran on its own. And upstairs, something that would haunt him forever, was a teenage boy standing in the hallway. The boy wore a tattered wedding dress, a cheap blonde wig, and smeared red lipstick across his face. In one hand he clutched a hatchet. His name was Daniel Lant. He had been living inside the walls of the Bowen house for months. After becoming obsessed with Tina, he had broken in and secretly carved out tunnels in the walls, installing peepholes to watch her and the rest of the family. The sounds, the missing objects, the unsettling feeling of being watched, it was all Daniel. Frank grabbed his daughters and ran. The police were called, and when they searched the home, they found Daniel curled up inside a wall cavity barely large enough to crouch in. There were piles of blankets, trash, and notebooks filled with disturbing writings. He was arrested, but shockingly released on bail. Weeks later, he would go on to murder a pregnant woman and her 2 children in another home he had broken into. He was finally caught and sentenced to life in prison. The Bowen family never returned to that house again. Fast forward to 2013, near Ohio State University. A group of 10 college students rented an old off-campus house. Rent was cheap, and the place was big enough to cram them all in. It wasn't perfect, flickering lights, weird plumbing, occasional thumps from the basement, but no one thought much of it. Until Brett, one of the tenants, started noticing strange things. The fridge would be emptier than expected. Cabinets were wide open in the morning. Lights turned on in rooms no one used. And then there was the locked door in the basement, labeled utility access. The landlord said to leave it alone. One night, after a storm knocked the power out, Brett went downstairs to flip the breaker. As he rounded the corner, he stopped cold. A barefoot man walked out of the basement. The man, calm and quiet, simply said, "I'm Jeremy," and casually walked upstairs. Panicked, Brett and the other roommates broke open the utility door. Inside they found a hidden living space, a mattress, shelves with books and personal photos, a guitar, even half-eaten food. Jeremy had been living there for weeks, maybe months. He had a copy of the key from when he was a previous tenant and had never left. He just slipped back in and quietly lived beneath them. He stole food, used the bathroom when no one was looking, and moved silently. The police were called, but Jeremy didn't resist. He packed a duffel bag and left. No charges were filed, but the roommates were rattled. They couldn't shake the thought of him lurking underneath them all that time. And things only got worse. Not long after, another group of students moved into the same house. They had heard the story but shrugged it off as a rumor. That is, until they too started noticing the same signs: vanishing food, lights on, footsteps in the night. One night, one of them went down to the basement and discovered another man, Jared. He was older, pale, and extremely thin. Like Jeremy, he had moved in without anyone knowing, using a copy of the house key to slip in and set up camp in the dark. Jared apologized and offered to leave. But his presence, his quiet movements, the feeling of being watched for weeks, it left the new group on edge. They changed the locks, installed cameras, and avoided the basement completely. Later, they would learn there was a name for this: frogging, when someone secretly lives in another person's home without being detected. But for them, it wasn't just a creepy term. It was real. And it was terrifying. This story was shared with me by a girl named Ashley, who lives by herself in a modest one-bedroom home just outside Spokane, Washington. She moved in during the previous winter, drawn to the house's vintage charm and the fact that it sat on a peaceful street tucked up against a wooded area. While a few friends warned her about living alone next to the forest, Ashley loved the sense of privacy it gave her. At first, everything was fine. She settled in quickly, adding personal touches and working from home as a freelance graphic designer. For the first few weeks, there were no issues. But that changed in mid-February. It started subtly, small things she could easily dismiss. A single spoon in the sink when she was sure she had already put it away. Her shampoo bottle moved slightly on the shelf. Lights flickering briefly in rooms she hadn't entered. She assumed it was just her imagination or fatigue. Maybe she was working too much. But then she started to hear things. Late at night, while she was lying in bed watching TV, a quiet tapping sound would come from within the walls. It wasn't random like pipes clanking, it was steady and rhythmic. Almost like someone knocking very gently with their knuckles. She chalked it up to the house settling. But it always seemed to happen after midnight. Sometimes, it began immediately after she turned the TV off, like it had been waiting. One night, she heard a different sound, a scraping, faint and brief, coming from the air vent high up on her bedroom wall. It was over in a second. She climbed onto a chair, used her phone's flashlight, and peered into the vent. There was nothing visible, just blackness and dust. Then, about 3 weeks after the strange noises began, Ashley woke up one morning to find her back door standing wide open. There was no sign of forced entry, and nothing appeared to be missing. It was just open, as if someone had left through it, or maybe entered. She called the police, and they came out to check things over. They suggested the door's lock could have malfunctioned and told her to replace it, which she did immediately. Still, Ashley couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. That night, while lying in bed, she heard it again. The scraping. And then footsteps. Not inside the house, but directly above her, in the space between the ceiling and the roof. She froze, too afraid to even breathe. As soon as she grabbed her phone, the noise stopped. She didn't sleep a second that night. The next morning, she pulled down the attic panel in the hallway and climbed up with a flashlight. Most of the attic was exactly what you'd expect: insulation, dust, old boards. But in one far corner, she saw something that didn't belong: a half-empty plastic water bottle, an energy bar wrapper, and a rolled-up sleeping bag. Someone had been living up there. Terrified, she rushed outside and called the police again. This time, they searched the house thoroughly. What they found was far worse than Ashley had imagined. Behind her bedroom closet, hidden inside a wall cavity, they found a man. He was curled up in a tight crawl space, surrounded by trash bags, clothes, and food wrappers. He had carved a narrow tunnel through the insulation, entering through a loose panel behind the furnace in the laundry room. He had even created a small opening in the wall hidden by a vent cover, one that gave him a perfect view of Ashley's bed. He had been watching her sleep every night. Police arrested the man, but he had no identification and refused to speak. He was likely a transient who had discovered the crawl space long before Ashley ever moved in. In fact, based on marks and footprints found in the attic, detectives believe he had been using that space for months, possibly even watching the house before Ashley became the tenant. She moved out that same week. The landlord tried to clean the place up and make it feel new, but no one wanted to rent it. Word had gotten around. Neighbors said a young couple eventually moved in several months later, only to move out less than 4 weeks afterward, no explanation given. As far as Ashley knows, that house still sits empty. In 1941, Denver, Colorado, a case unfolded that would later be called one of the most bizarre home invasion stories in American history. Philip Peters was a 73-year-old widower and retired railroad auditor. With his wife recovering in the hospital, he lived alone in their quiet Victorian home, an aging structure with narrow crawl spaces and a creaky charm. He kept to a strict routine, known to his neighbors as a kind and predictable man. But while Peters believed he was living alone, someone else had made a home just above his head. Unbeknownst to him, a man named Theodore Coneys, an ill and destitute local in his 60s, had broken into his home while it was empty. Once inside, Coneys discovered a small crawl space in the attic just big enough to crawl into, and decided to stay. Desperate and homeless, he began secretly living above Peters, sneaking down only when the house was empty to steal food, water, and newspapers. For weeks, he lived like a shadow, silent, careful. The odd creaks and taps that Peters occasionally noticed he dismissed as the sounds of an old house settling. But one evening, Peters came home earlier than expected and heard something above. As he investigated, he climbed toward the attic hatch, and was suddenly face to face with Coneys. Startled and afraid of being caught, Coneys panicked and attacked. Grabbing an old cast iron shaker from the stove, he bludgeoned Peters to death. He then disappeared back into the crawl space before police arrived. The scene baffled authorities. The house had no signs of forced entry. Nothing was missing. The doors were locked from the inside. The crime was dubbed the Denver Ghost House Murder, and the investigation went cold. But Coneys never left. For 5 more weeks, he continued to live in that same attic, mere feet above the gruesome scene he created. Eventually, suspicious neighbors noticed flickers of light and movement in what was believed to be an abandoned home and called police again. This time, officers searched the attic. Hidden in the darkness, curled in the filth of the crawl space, they found Coneys, barely coherent, covered in grime, and living like a feral animal. He confessed to the killing immediately. The press nicknamed him the Denver Spider-Man. He was sentenced to life in prison. The house was never lived in again. Fast forward to 2012, South Carolina. A woman and her 5 children had just started over after escaping an abusive relationship. Her ex, a man with a long criminal history and troubling behavior, had finally been pushed out of their lives. Or so she thought. At first, the signs were subtle, small things like food disappearing faster than expected, faint noises in the night, and items not being where she left them. She wrote it off as stress, exhaustion, maybe even the kids being careless. Then one night while lying in bed, she noticed nails from the ceiling pushing downward, like someone was trying to remove them. She heard faint scratching, thumps, even what sounded like whispers. Still, she convinced herself it was nothing, until one morning she woke up to find bits of insulation scattered across her bed. Fearing something was seriously wrong, she sent her teenage nephew up into the attic to investigate. What he discovered was horrifying. Her ex-boyfriend had been living up there, quietly hiding above the family for over 2 weeks. He had constructed a crude bedding area using coats and blankets, and left behind cups filled with urine and feces. Even more disturbing, he had positioned himself above her room, spying through a vent directly above her bed. He had been watching her and her children as they slept, When discovered, he calmly climbed down and left the house before the police could arrive. Though no harm had been done physically, the psychological damage was irreversible. The woman was left shaken, haunted by the idea that someone she once trusted had lived so close, hidden in the shadows of her own home. In early February 2020, a man living in Oklahoma City began noticing strange and subtle disturbances around his home. At first, it was small, almost dismissible things. A cereal box that seemed to be used more than he remembered. The thermostat temperature changed overnight without explanation. One morning, he found the back door unlocked, even though he always checked it before bed. He initially chalked it up to forgetfulness, stress, or perhaps a harmless prank. Maybe an animal had gotten in somehow. But the small occurrences didn't stop, they continued, always minor, but just unsettling enough to stick in the back of his mind. Eventually, the unease grew into suspicion. He decided to check the attic, expecting maybe a raccoon or a bird's nest causing the disturbances. But when he pulled down the hatch and shined his flashlight inside, he froze. There, tucked in the far corner of the attic, was a filthy mattress, a heap of old clothing, and a man, asleep. The man appeared to be in his 30s, with matted hair and sunken eyes. The homeowner backed away in horror and immediately called 911, holding the man at gunpoint until the police arrived. The intruder had broken in through a neglected attic access point on the rear exterior of the house, one the owner hadn't even realized was there. Police discovered that the man had been secretly living in the attic for nearly a full week. During the day, he would wait silently above, and when the homeowner left, he'd descend to eat food from the pantry, use the bathroom, and wander around the home like he belonged there. Then, he would quietly retreat to his nest in the attic and go to sleep, leaving almost no trace. The man had no prior connection to the homeowner and didn't offer much of a reason, just that he was desperate, cold, and trying to survive. He was arrested and charged with unlawful entry. While the homeowner wasn't physically harmed, he admitted that after that experience, he never felt safe in that house again. The idea that a stranger had been sleeping just feet above him changed the way he saw his own home forever. In Portland, Oregon, Lisa Leihart had recently moved into a cozy 1950s-era house just outside the city after a rough breakup. It was her first time living alone, and though the place had its quirks, squeaky floors and noisy pipes, it offered the peace she was looking for. It was quiet, private, and just enough space for her and her dog. For the first couple of months, everything felt normal. But not long after settling in, she began to feel like something was off. At night, as she lay in bed, she would sometimes hear faint sounds, soft breathing, so quiet it was almost indistinguishable from the wind. It always seemed to come from the wall right next to her bed. She dismissed it at first as her imagination or faulty plumbing. But the sounds continued, muffled, heavy breathing. Lisa checked the wall, moving her nightstand aside. There was nothing there except an old, square metal panel about a foot wide, bolted shut. Maybe an old maintenance hatch, she thought. Harmless. But then the noises escalated. Between 2 and 4 a.m., she began hearing slow, deliberate tapping sounds, like fingertips rapping against wood. One night, she was frozen in bed, staring at the ceiling, when she heard something even worse, a whisper. Indistinct and low, but undeniably a voice. It came from inside the wall. That was the first night Lisa grabbed her dog and drove to her friend's house, refusing to sleep in that room. When she told her friend about the noises, they joked about ghosts or haunted houses. But Lisa didn't think it was paranormal. It sounded too real, too human. For the next week, she slept on the couch, but even there, she occasionally heard distant shuffling sounds. A few times, she swore she heard breathing from behind the walls in other rooms. Eventually, unable to take it anymore, she decided to open the panel. She grabbed a crowbar and started working at the screws, only to realize they weren't even fastened properly. The panel lifted off easily. Behind it was a narrow cavity, a dark space that extended further than she expected. As she angled her phone's flashlight into the void, she saw insulation, dust, and wood beams, and then she saw him. A man. Sitting in the far corner of the space, knees pulled to his chest, motionless and staring straight at her with wide, unblinking eyes. He looked filthy, pale, and thin. He didn't say a word. He just stared like he'd been waiting for her to look. Lisa screamed and dropped her phone, running out of the house without looking back. The man never came out, but when police arrived and searched the crawl space, they confirmed he had been living in there for weeks, maybe longer. They found a sleeping bag, piles of food wrappers, bottles filled with urine, and something even more disturbing, drawings. Dozens, maybe hundreds of them, drawn on wood, insulation, and even paper scraps. Many of them depicted a woman, clearly Lisa. Investigators found that he had gained access through an old storage hatch in the basement utility closet, which led directly into the wall cavities and crawl spaces behind the walls of her bedroom. He had been watching her sleep for weeks. The man was never identified. He had no ID and vanished before police could track him down. Some believed he was homeless. Others thought he might have had more sinister motives. But Lisa had no intention of sticking around to find out. She moved out that same week and never looked back. To this day, the man was never found. And the house, according to neighbors, remains empty.